It's very dangerous. You walk into the masjid, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in another corner of the mosque, there's a group of just teaching and learning from each other. And the Prophet, he goes over to the people who are saying, he says, look, what those guys are doing over there, praying, that's great, that's brilliant, that's important. But I've been sent to teach. So when he walks into the mosque, instead of going to all the people who are praying, the Prophet goes and sits with the people who are teaching and learning. We realize how important it is to learn constantly. In fact, it's wajib upon us to learn from the cradle to the grave. From when you're born to when you die, it's wajib to keep learning, constantly learn, and we do. But you realize that no, not what we do. From the moment you're born, you're starting to learn things. You start to learn who my parents are. From the moment you open what? Saluni. He says, ask me before you lose me. Why would he tell us to do with that knowledge? I can't teach anybody else that I might get some sawab from it. It's not like I'm going to learn something and it's going to make me loads of money in one day. It's not like that knowledge is going to do much for me. But what it will do is when you learn different things, what you also learn is how to think, how to process that information, how to recognize information. And when you do that, you take yourself on a path of understanding more and more and more. And honestly, the more you look at anything, because the Imam, he didn't say go learn about Islam. He didn't say go learn about Tawheed. He didn't say go learn. The truth is, when you start looking at the delicacies and the details of every single thing, it should in truth lead you back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For instance, when you look at biology, I'll give you guys a very basic example. In fact, I'll give you two. One example, and this one's one that I really like. It's one that I heard this year, in fact, it's not. It's the example of your hair. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I need to get a haircut every 2 weeks, otherwise, well, I look like this. If I don't get my hair cut very often, then my hair, it grows far too much, and it doesn't look good, right? So I get my hair cut every 2 weeks. Here's the deal, though. Never once have I ever had to get a haircut for my eyebrows. Might be different for the girls, but for me, I've never had to get my eyebrows done, or I've never had to trim my eyebrows, no. But my hair, I have to trim that every 2 weeks. And then my beard, I have to get that trimmed as well. I have to get that shaped and sorted, right? Because my beard grows. What's the difference between my hair on the hair on my head and my eyebrows? It's what? 3 fingers? It's a bit more for some of you guys, but still. It's about, for me, it's about 3 fingers between my hairline and my eyebrows, right? That's between the two. But the hair on my head is constantly growing, the hair on my eyebrows isn't. Why? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designed us so perfectly, so brilliant, with such delicacy and detail, that my body knows this hair isn't meant to grow, but this, right? You got bandages on your arm, whatever happened, if you got cut, right? I can't tell you how my body fixes itself. I can't ask you and expect you to tell me what my body does that fixes it. A scab will grow, and after a little while, once that scab's gone, the cut, that will be healed. It will be fine. I've had loads of cuts, especially on my arm, right? I've had loads of cuts. I can't see a single one of them today. But I couldn't tell you how my body fixes itself. It just does. My body just knows what to do without me knowing what to do. But how does that work? How can that possibly be the case? If I tear a piece of paper, it doesn't fix itself. It doesn't form itself, stick back together again, but my body, it does that. If I study biology, and I start wondering, how is it possible that all of this is going on in my body, all of the delicacies, it should in truth lead me back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's brilliance, to how amazing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is because of how delicate and how brilliantly perfect my body is created. That's the delicacy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what knowledge gives you. That's what knowledge takes you to. Recite Allah sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala. See, it's not about the facts and the figures and the knowledge, no. It's more about what you do with that knowledge, how you learn to understand it and recognize it. In fact, in natural balagha, he says, al-ilmu ilman. In another place he says, al-aqlu aqlan. Knowledge is of 2 types. And then in another place he says, intellect is of 2 types. And we ask, what are those 2 types? What are the 2 types? Imam Ali describes that in natural balagha as well. He says the 2 types are the knowledge that you hear and the knowledge that you absorb. The knowledge that you hear is not useful to you. It has nothing of benefit to you unless you absorb it. The knowledge you absorb, that's beneficial, that has value for you, that does something for you. But the knowledge that you just hear, that's not doing anything. What's the difference between hearing something and absorbing it? When you absorb it, you try and understand it. You try and take it on board. You try and recognize it, figure out what it means, what it's talking about. That's when it's beneficial for you. When you learn to think. In the same way for your exams, for those of you who are a bit older, you'll understand this, right? You'll be sitting there in your lessons thinking, especially if you're doing maths, right? You'll be sitting there thinking, what has any of this got to do with me? When am I ever going to use Pythagoras or simultaneous equations in my real life? That it just doesn't apply. It has no impact on my life whatsoever. And you sit there and you think, why do I have to learn this? If I need to find out what the third side of a triangle is, I'll just use a ruler. It's not that difficult. It's not that deep. But in school you have to learn that, and you have to give exams on it. And those exams, they become super important. Why? I'll let you guys on a little secret. I used to work for Pearson, also known as LSL, the company that makes a lot of your exams. And the whole point isn't, do you know how to find the third side of a triangle? They don't really care about that. What they care about in your exams is, if I ask you this question, will you be able to figure out how to find the answer? They don't care about you finding that third side of the triangle. They care about, if I ask you a question, do you in your head know, okay, that's what they're actually asking me? Of all the skills I learn in my lessons, do I know which one to pick in this moment to answer this question? When you can do that, when you can apply the right solution to the right question, whether you get the answer right or wrong, you get marks for working out, right? And you get more marks for working out than you do for your answer in your exams. Because what matters is, are you able to apply the knowledge that you've learned? Can you figure out what bits of knowledge this exam question is asking you? It's not about the facts and the figures in your head. We don't care about that. What we care about is what you do with it. How you learn to think, how you learn to develop, how you learn to understand those facts and figures. That's what's important. So Islam says that it's wajib to learn, and you have to keep learning. What we're really trying to learn is how to think, how to understand knowledge, how to take it on board. And over the next 10 days, inshallah, we're going to keep this in mind. Everything we learn, we're going to talk about how we can figure that out, how we can make sense of it. The intellectual side of it. Because intellect is important in Islam. Like we said in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks the question, can the one who is intelligent be the same as the one who isn't? It can't. Intellect is elevated above stupidity. In fact, in one place, our fourth Imam, Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salatu wassalam, he's instructing the fifth Imam on what kinds of friends to keep. Or rather, what kinds of friends not to keep. What kinds of people to not have as his friends. And in that, one of the types he says is don't be friends with a fool. Somebody who is foolish, somebody who is stupid. Why? Because even though they might try and help you, because they don't have the intellect and the intelligence, they won't be able to help you. See, again, I'm not talking about your grades at school. I'm not talking about how many facts and figures and trivia you know. I'm not talking about how much stats you know. In fact, there's a really great story of a man in a place called Karaj. This man, everybody used to go to him and ask him for advice. And he used to give really good advice. He really helped out the people who came to him. Constantly, they go to him, they ask him, they tell him their problems, he'd give them advice, they'd go away, and, generally speaking, the advice was always good. So one day a man comes to him and he asks him for advice, he gets the advice, and then he asks him, he says, how did you come to know all of this stuff? How did you come to give such great advice? How did you become so intelligent, so smart? And the man, his answer is brilliant. He says, I'm illiterate. I never learned to read or write. So I just constantly sat down and I used to think. I just think about it, that's all I do. I don't know how to read or write, all I do is think. Everything I see, everything I observe in the world, I think about it. And because of that, I'm able to recognize what's going on around me. I'm able to see what's going on around me. I've learned what the world is like. The man said, I didn't learn to read or write. Forget the facts and the figures, forget your grades, all of that. Learning to think, that's the most important thing. He says, I didn't know how to read or write, I thought a lot. And in fact, thinking, reflection is one of the most important things. We have one of our hadith, it tells us that 1 hour of thinking and reflection, just 1 hour, is better than a whole year's worth of namaz and roza and hajj zakat and all of those worships that you do. to stop and think is one of the best things you can do. And so, over these next 10 days, that's what we're going to do. I'm not going to be throwing loads of facts and figures at you. What we're going to do is we're going to learn to think. Think about each of the different topics and each of the different things that we're looking at. We're going to learn how to think about them, how to understand them. Because it's that understanding that's key. From these lectures, I could sit here and give you 100 facts and figures. And you might remember all of them, you might not remember any of them. What really matters is if you walk away from these knowing how to think. And I'll mention it in one last example before I move towards the side. How to think. The way to think is with logic and reason. Islam is a religion of reason, it's a religion of logic, right? And logic is really simple, but most people, they don't use it. Logic is really, really easy to understand, but most people, they don't apply logic to their lives, they don't apply logic. Logic is basically just maths. It's A plus B equals C. It's super easy. I'll give you guys an example, right? Let's say A and B, they're going to be two statements, and from them we should be able to figure out a third. One of the greatest definitions of intelligence that I've heard is to be able to know two things and figure out a third. So, for instance, A is, I don't know, the first statement is, everybody in this room is an Arsenal fan. I'm an Arsenal fan, so I'll use that example. Everybody in this room is an Arsenal fan. Now, statement B will be, I don't know, let's say this guy. B, Abdullah is not an Arsenal fan. So what can we figure out from that? From those two things alone, I can figure out that Abdullah is not in the room. Because everybody in the room is an Arsenal fan, and he's not an Arsenal fan. So that means he's not in this room. It's super simple when you think about it like that, like A plus B equals C. When I put those two things together, I can figure out a third thing from them. It's super simple. But we apply that to everything in our life. When we look at every situation as logic, as rationality, you start to make much better decisions in life. You start to understand how to think and how to see the world. And inshallah, that's what we'll do over the next 9 days. Recite aloud Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. You see, to understand what happened in Karbala, you have to use the intellect. You have to use knowledge. To understand what happened in Karbala, you have to use your mind. And that's very obvious and very evident. It's very clear. But Islam, at the same time, although it is a religion of rationale, a religion of logic, a religion of reasoning, and we take pride in that fact, it's also a religion that recognizes the importance of our emotions, the value of our emotions. In fact, the value of our tears is very important. We'll come to this over the next few days, inshallah, the value of your tears. But there's one story that I always like to remember whenever I recite Majlis in the place for the first time. There's one story that I always like to recall. It's the story of an old lady and her son. They didn't have anybody else, it was just the old lady and her son. They used to live together. They didn't have any friends or anybody who used to come to visit them or spend time with them. It was just the two of them. And every year, the old lady and her son, in the first 10 days of Muharram, they would hold majalis for Imam Abdullah, they would hold majlises for Imam Hussein. 10 days of majlises in the first 10 days of Muharram. One year, that lady's son passed away. When her son passed away, now she's all alone. She doesn't have anybody to stand by her side, nobody to help her. Holding majlises is not easy. You have to do a lot of work, a lot of prep to have these majlises ready. This woman, she tried and she tried, but when she lost her son, she became old, she became frail. It was difficult for her to hold a majlis that year. She was trying and trying, but she couldn't do it. She got to the point where it was the night before Muharram. At this point, she raises her hands in dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She says, Ya Allah, you're my witness. I tried to hold majalis this year. I wanted to hold a majlis for Imam Hussein this year, but now that I'm alone, I can't do it. Now that I'm alone, it's too difficult. There's nobody to help me. She's upset that she can't hold the majlis, but she's accepted. A few hours later, she hears a knock at her door. She opens the door and she sees there's a woman standing in front of her, and she says to her, look, I've heard that every year you hold majlises. I was traveling through the town, I'll be here for a few days. I wanted to take part in the majlis of Imam Hussein. The old lady, she looks at the woman, she says, I'm afraid this year I can't do it. Every year I do. In my house we hold majalis, but this year I can't. Saying that, The lady, she looks at this woman, she says, look, you want to hold majalis, I want to attend majalis, you're struggling to do it alone, why don't I help you? We'll do it together. We'll hold these majlises together and we'll make them happen one way or another. So the two women, they band together and they make these majalis happen. The first day goes by, second day, third day, fourth day, the days keep rolling by. And the owner of the house, the old lady, she says, I noticed something very odd. She says, every day, this woman, my guest, who's helping me hold these majlises, she would come and before everybody arrived, she would stand at the door and she would welcome in each guest as though this was her house, as though she was holding the majlis herself. And at the end, when everyone was leaving, she would stand at the door and thank everybody for coming as though it was her house, as though it was her majlis. When it was my house, I hold these majalis, I was the host of the majalis. So every day I noticed, I found it very odd, but I didn't say it. When the 9th of Muharram comes, the majlis finishes, and this lady, she comes to the host, she comes to the old lady, and she says to her, look, thank you very much for these last 9 days of majalis, but if you forgive me, I have to leave now. The old lady, confused, she says, what do you mean you have to leave now? Tomorrow's Ashura. Tomorrow is the day that we've been building up towards. Tomorrow is the climax of everything that we've been building towards. How can you leave now? But the lady, she keeps repeating the same thing over and over again. She says, excuse me, let me go, please. I have a very long way. The woman keeps trying to convince her, but she realizes she can't be convinced. She thanks the woman eventually and lets her go on her way. The day of Ashura, on the day of Ashura, they wrap up, everything is finished. It's saved me, Imam is asked to commit that Yazid will be the ruler. In that moment, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he says something very important, and these are words that we'll remember throughout the 10 days. He says what? He says, Misli la yubayu misluhu. Someone like me cannot ever accept, cannot ever give allegiance to someone like him. Saying that Imam Hussein accepts, cannot ever give allegiance to someone like him. Saying that Imam Hussein turns around to leave, as he turns around to leave. Abbas from outside, he hears his master call out. He breaks the doors and rushes in. As he rushes in, Hussein, he places his hand on the chest of Abbas. He says to Abu Fadl, Abbas, the time has come for us to leave the city of Medina. The city of my grandfather is no longer safe for us. Imam Hussein, in that night, he was very worried. He was in a lot of pain. It is said that Hussein alayhi salam, he visited the grave that Hussein alayhi salam, he visited the grave of his grandfather not once, not twice, but 3 times. He went back and forth from his house to the grave of Rasulullah. On the 3rd time, as he goes to the grave of Rasulullah, he begins crying and weeping, remembering his grandfather, remembering how they used to play together in this city when his grandfather was alive. It is said that in that moment, as he was crying and weeping, at one point Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he falls unconscious from I will not welcome Hussein anymore. In that moment, it is said, Imam Hussein said to Rasulullah, Ya Rasulullah, call me back to you. I don't wish to stay here any longer. Rasulullah replies, Hussein, the time is very near. I will be standing at the fountain of Kawthar. You will be coming towards me from Allah, and to Allah we will return. From there he goes towards Jannatul Baqi, where his brother is buried, where the mark of Sayyidah Zahra is. But there's a difference in how he went to the grave of Rasulullah and how Hussein goes to Jannatul Baqi. What is that difference? It is narrated that when Abu Abdullah went to the grave of Rasulullah, he walked like a man with purpose. He walked like a soldier, almost as though he was marching to the grave of Rasulullah. But when he goes from the grave of Rasulullah to Jannatul Baqi, it is said Abu Abdullah was stumbling and falling, almost rushing and running, as he couldn't wait to get to the grave of Hasan Mujtaba, to the mark of Sayyidah Zahra. My heart tells me why. As he walked through those streets, he must have looked out and seen, in this road, my brother Hassan and I would run and jump and play. In this road, my grandfather would carry me in his arms. In this place, I would walk around with my mother. She would look after me. We see Imam Hussein Abul Fadl Abbas, he says, my Mawla, my master, everybody is prepared, everybody is ready. Now Hussein turns to Abbas as the sun begins to rise. He turns to Abbas, he says, Abbas, before we leave, there is something I need you to do. Abul Fadl Abbas, Hussein says, Abbas, that moment, a man's full house, his face shining.